So today's the big day that Guaido returns to Venezuela, supposedly. Guaido has spent the last couple weeks in a sort of self-imposed exile. He's been touring around Latin America, visiting with all the leaders and trying to shore up his support to make sure that everybody around there is supporting him and not Maduro, so that he has sort of this, even though he's not in power right now, he'll build up his sort of sense of legitimacy in international politics. And so there's been some very important work he's been doing the last couple weeks for his sake. Of course, the two leaders, well, I guess three, who he wouldn't have met with would have been the leaders of Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba, who are all friends to Maduro. But today is the day of his big homecoming now, where he's going to come back and reclaim the throne, or whatever they call the president's chair in Venezuela. And on the face of it, this would seem to be like a suicide mission. Why would you, after advocating the overthrow of the government and calling your president illegitimate, go back to your country where you would probably be arrested? Well, the answer is because the U.S. and its allies have been making it very clear for the last couple days that if Maduro lays one finger on Guaido, it will mean a U.S. invasion. The U.S. Surrogates could not have been made this any more clear than they have. Marco Rubio and John Bolton chief among them, hammering it home, multiple times a day on Twitter that Maduro cannot touch this guy at all, or else the U.S. is going to get involved because it'll be seen as an attack on a U.S. ally, which is kind of funny. And, of course, to support him, many of the Venezuelan opposition groups are trying to organize a series of demonstrations across the country so that you have this big outpouring of support, for him. It kind of works well with coups to have people in the streets supporting the coup. So, essentially, a trap has been laid for Maduro. If Maduro is a complete buffoon, he will arrest Guaido at the airport when he lands, and then be on the wrong end of a few Raytheon bombs and whatever else the U.S. decides to sling his way in response. Now, judging by Maduro's leadership over the past few years, I can't exactly say that I think he's the brightest man, so perhaps he will be dumb enough or arrogant enough to try and arrest Guaido even under such strong threats from the U.S. I mean, hell, even Spain, I think it was their foreign minister, was saying, hey, Venezuela cannot arrest Guaido, or else, there's gonna be trouble for them. It's like, oh yeah, there's big talk coming from Spain. But if all goes well for the U.S., Guaido will be arrested, because then that will justify their invasion, and finally they'll be rid of the Bolivarian regime once and for all. The U.S. has wanted them out of there at least since, the early Bush administration, because there was an attempted coup, I believe, in 2002 against Chavez. But, of course, that was not very well thought out, since Chavez was someone who came from the military and tried to lead a military coup himself before he was elected back in 98. So it wasn't there weren't many officers in the military who were willing to rebel against Chavez, and so it was a very quickly quashed coup. But from the sounds of it, the way Rubio's talking, Venezuela's just the start. Because Rubio has also been targeting the allies of Venezuela, namely Nicaragua and Cuba most notably, and he's been making some very cryptic threats saying that, the days of the reign of tyranny in Venezuela is almost over, and it soon will be for Cuba too, sort of implying that, hey, once Maduro arrests Guaido, and that's sort of our trigger to invade Venezuela, we can then invade Cuba. And you say, well, why invade Cuba? That seems completely unrelated. Well, it's not entirely unrelated, because Rubio has been laying the groundwork for an invasion of Cuba for quite some time. He's been trying to claim on Twitter that there have been Cuban officers assisting Maduro in Venezuela, which is probably true. That's a very common thing that Cuba does. They did it with Angola. They did it with other things. That's sort of how Cuban foreign policy works, is they send in military advisors, similar to what the U.S. does a lot. I guess they kind of learn from the best. But yeah, Cuba likes to send in military advisors, and Rubio's been kind of accusing them of terrible war crimes. So my guess is that after they're able to get their war in Venezuela, then it would seem to me that Rubio will then be making the case afterwards that, well, we have to go after Cuba now because Cuba committed all these terrible war crimes, assisting the terrible regime we just overthrew in Venezuela. And it'll be a good time for him to do that since, the U.S. will already be in a war footing. It'd be pretty easy to transition from fighting in Venezuela and then moving over to Cuba. I mean, again, it's 90 miles from from Florida, so it's pretty close. It's not like American troops haven't fought in Cuba before. All I can say is that for Cuba's sake, I hope that whoever the puppet is that the U.S. Ends up deciding to prop up there, assuming they do invade and overthrow the current regime, I hope that that they at least pick a better puppet in Cuba than they did in Venezuela, because, I mean, Guaido really isn't that much better than Maduro. You could say, oh, well, maybe he's not so insensitive as to eat an empanada on TV when people are starving. Yes, that's true. Okay, he's probably a little bit nicer. He does have that Obama look to him. Actually, he reminds me a lot of Obama, the way he rolls his sleeves up and stuff, takes his tie off. But, I mean, politically speaking, I mean, Guaido's still a socialist, so I find it strange that all these right-wingers in the U.S. are talking about the need to invade Venezuela as if it's some sort of socialism versus capitalism fight. It's absolutely not. There are no capitalists in Venezuela. There's nobody there who likes the market. I mean, there is this one woman, forget the name. I think it's like Bante Venezuela or something. It's the name of her party. She has no support, though. I mean, and even she is a pretty, she's not exactly an arch-capitalist, but she would be fine by moderate Republican standards in the U.S. She'd certainly fit in to the American right. However, that's not who they're propping up. They're propping up this Guaido guy, who, again, is a socialist. Doesn't make any sense. But in Cuba, hopefully, they've had enough bad experience with communism that the only opposition would be staunch anti-communists, and hopefully even pro-market people, because again, there is a difference. You can be against communism and still not necessarily a market guy. I mean, Hitler was a big anti-communist, as you may recall. Not exactly a fan of the market, though, or of economics in general. He called it the Jewish science. I mean, really, I feel quite bad for people in Latin America because they suffer under a cycle of just terrible regimes being interchanged for one another. You never really get any better. I mean, the only place that's seen, I think, really great progress has been Chile, and that was kind of on a fluke because the dictator down there, Pinochet, happened to hire some halfway decent economists back in the 70s to advise him to some extent on economic policy. And he didn't even listen to all of their recommendations, but they had enough of a sway over the government to make Chile a somewhat successful economy. And today, they're by far the best place to live in Latin America, in my opinion. But again, that was a fluke. Whoever we install in all these other countries, they're most likely going to listen to whatever the conventional wisdom is around academia in their country. Or, frankly, even if they listen to the conventional wisdom of academia in the U.S., they're gonna have a bad time. And so, yeah, for Venezuela and Cuba, I don't see much hope. But, hey, I hope I'm wrong. If you've made it this far, please do like this video and hit the subscribe button. I very much appreciate it. And leave me a comment with your thoughts on what you think is going to happen in Venezuela and Cuba. If you think things can get any better, or regime change is definitely going to happen. But if you think that a U.S. invasion is not necessarily imminent, I'd like to hear your reasons. So I'll see you all tomorrow.